I suppose we can consider this class, it's, if you will, it's a summary of Avrohom Avinu's life until the Akedah. It overviews Avroham's story not in particular events, but in categories. And the way it does it is by asking a simple question. Avrohom Avinu has two parshas in the Chumash. There are two parshas in the Chumash that are distinctly Avroham's. Lech Lecha and Vayera. Chayesod is already Yitzchak. Toldos is already Yankov and Esav. Vayetze is already Yankov having children. But Avrohom has two parshas, Lech Lecha and Vayera. Why? So as we always do in our Sichos class, is we read what I underlined. I'm going to read from underline to underline unless I otherwise specify. If you'll follow inside, you'll have no trouble. Just read what I underlined, that's all. Ha-Parshes, the two Parshas, Shekol Teichnon Misachas Lavram B'miyuchad, that the entire spirit of these two Parshas are deal with Avram specifically, Hein Parshas Lech Lecha or Parshas Vayera. Or Lech Lecha and Vayera. Umizeh Shenechleku Lebeis Parshas, the fact that they're divided into two Parshas, Harei Mukhrach proves, Shabehen Mizbates, the reason Avroham's life is divided up into two Torah sections is not because the Parsha is not allowed to be too long or too short, but because they express Shtei Parshes, two sections or sugim, categories, Be'inyane u'malos shel Avram Avinu. The life of Avram Avinu has two milas, that means advantages, two levels, and because Avram Avinu's life is divided into two levels, the Torah divides his life into two parshas. I divided his life into five. The Torah divides his life into two. The five I gave you were discovering God intellectually, becoming a prophet, doing what God said, circumcision, and Akedah, the event of offering up Yitzchak as a carbon. To me, those are the five stages of Avraham's life. The Rebbe says those five are really two. Before the Bris and after the Bris. All of us understand that if you want to understand the personality of Avram Avinu, all you have to do is think about divine service, because that's what he was, a servant of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Accordingly, these two parshes, Henштei Madreges, are two steps, Ba'avedase Hanailis, in the lofty service, Shel Avram Avinu. So we know two things. We're talking about Avram Avinu, we're talking about a service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and they're divided up into two. But Parshas Lech Lecha, in the section of Lech Lecha, Hameduberhu b'madreges Avram Avinu olav hashalom k'mei shehaya kaidem hikansei b'bris milah. Lech Lecha describes the entire life of Avram Avinu until he was circumcised. Parenthesis. V'rak b'soifa mesupur, at the very end of the parsha, it teaches us, tells the story, how he was commanded by God to do the circumcision, as b'nei beis in his family, v'shekein us, and he did it. Sure, the last few psukim of the parsha describe how he did the bris, but the parsha per se deals with everything leading to the bris. Ube parshas Vayera, in the section of Vayera, meduber b'Avram Avinu, it's the story of Avram Avinu's life, le'achariseh, subsequent to the bris, the shekvar kiyeh mitzvahs milah. He did the mitzvah circumcision. Turn to page 50, and the Parshas Vayera describes what happened to him after the bris took place. And the Rebbe wants to say, the fact that the Torah divides his life in two means that there's two concepts to his life, and the two concepts of his life are connected to the bris milah. And the question is, why is bris milah such a big deal? Says the Rebbe. Isa Bezayah, the Zayah tells us, the actually Nimal Avram, so long as Avram was not circumcised, Hoysa Dargas Nevuasei, his level of prophecy was Bebechinas, on a category of, quote, Haya Devar Hashem al Avram Ba'machazeh. God appeared to Avram Avinu in a vision. Now the word vision can be said in two Hebrew words, Mar'eh and Machazeh. Re'iyah and Chizayon. Both mean vision. The difference is one is Aramaic and the other is Hebrew. Machazeh is considered Aramaic. Mar'eh is considered Hebrew. Mashein came bisman shel acharehim meila. As soon as Avrohom does a bris, it says in the Torah, Vayera elav Hashem. God appears to him. But now the Hebrew word that denotes the prophecy and the vision is not chizayon, which is the Aramaic word for vision, but the re'iyah, the Hebrew word for vision. That's what says in Zohar. The Zohar says why? Why until the bris is God's revelation to Avram called chizayon, and once the bris is called mana? It's simple. Angels don't speak Aramaic. Don't ask me why. Angels don't speak Aramaic. Okay? Consequently, so long as he wasn't circumcised, God comes to Abraham in a vision using Aramaic form, Shuloshan Targum, which is language of Aramaic, so that the angels shouldn't complain. If God would speak to Avram in Hebrew, the Malach would come along and say, excuse me, why are you talking to him? Talk to us. But when God speaks to the angels in Aramaic, to Avram in Aramaic, they just don't understand. Why is God revealing himself to one circumcised person? Once the bris milah, once the circumcision takes place, they no longer have this possibility to complain. God Almighty appears to Avram Avinu with the Hebrew word Re'iyah b'lashon hakodesh, hamoida al madrega yeniyetz, which shows on a higher level. Again, until the bris, Hashem cannot afford to talk to Avram and have the angels notice, because they would protest. So he speaks in Aramaic. Once the bris, he can afford to speak to Hashem and Avram in Hebrew, because the angels don't have anything to say. Now, two questions. First of all, who cares what the angels say? And second of all, what does this mean? What does it mean that the angels are going to protest? So we read on by prefacing. Here goes the Sikh. I'm on page 50, second column. What is the difference between Hebrew and Aramaic? Let's talk about this for a moment. Language is one of humanity's greatest inventions. Everybody understands that. Language is an incredible thing. And the diversity of language is also incredible. When you ask anthropologists, social scientists, evolutionists, where language comes from, so they explained that we were apes and didn't speak, and we learned to speak slowly, right? And as they say in English, blah, 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 blah. But we believe that God created man directly. That's the truth. And the Targum tells us in Bereshis, man became a living being, says the Targum that we can speak. One of the greatest denotations of humanity is the ability to speak. And this is really a conundrum. People have been studying for a very long time. They can't understand why orangutans and chimpanzees and gorillas don't develop language. They are biologically, genetically, 98% like us, and only 2% genetic difference. And they have the same plumbing for the most part. They're very intelligent animals. And they teach them sign language and so on. But why is language unique to humanity? And of course, if you know anything about what's amazing about language, it's not that we talk, but that we're talkers. You know what that means? Learning to speak doesn't take a genius. A baby is born, and he begins to make sounds almost immediately. So do animals. He imitates what his parents do. He mimics. That's how children are called, parroting, right? And when a child turns 2, there is an abrupt radiation of language. It's an amazing thing to watch. One day, the kid just starts to talk. And this is a biological anomaly. In other words, this is not only evolution. There's something that happens to a baby when they reach a certain age. They suddenly start to talk. How? You say a word, they repeat it 10 times. Any word they hear, they repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat. And usually, of course, by the time they finish repeating it, they distort it. And this is why we have so much fun at children's expenses. But you watch children learn to speak. It's an instinct. You don't have to go to school to learn to speak. You just speak. It's like learning to walk. A baby till a certain age cannot walk, and then he gets up and he walks. And after that, he walks effortlessly. You don't worry about people falling. Language was built into humanity. In other words, it's not that children speak, but they don't even think about it. If you teach a gorilla to speak, every time he says a word, he has to have incredible concentration to get that word out, because he's not a talker. He's talking, but he's not a talker. It's in our soul, Pash. It's in our subconscious that we just speak. It's one of the greatest gifts God gave humanity. Now, according to Torah again, language begins with the Torah. God created the world according to a blueprint. The blueprint is the Torah. The Torah is written in Lashon HaKodesh, what we would call today, not precisely, but nevertheless, Hebrew, the Holy Tongue. According to Torah, before the great dispersion, before the day of Haflaga, there was only one language. Dvarim Achadim and Safa Achas. Everybody spoke Lashon HaKodesh. Everyone spoke Hebrew. In other words, etymologically, Torah says you should be able to trace all languages back to Hebrew. I know that's not so easy. I actually came across a note in a book once that said that written languages can all be traced back to a Semitic language, which is about 15,000 years old, which is interesting. But spoken languages, nobody that I've ever seen in the secular world will say that the first spoken language was Hebrew. But according to Torah, that's a fact. The original language was Hebrew. And Hebrew was the hardwiring. In other words, when you get the computer, there's, the hardware and the software. The hardware was Hebrew. Man was created to speak in Lashon HaKodesh. And for close to 2,000 years, that was the language they spoke. Then, because of the day of Haflaga, God wanted people to disperse, become distinct. God created language, God created race, God created divisions. And one of those divisions was the people who speak many languages. And of course, it was like a 2-year-old who hears you say a word and then repeats it and repeats it and repeats it, and it gets distorted, and it becomes a new word, until through isolated populations, which is how they explain the diversification of language, words become so distinct, even though they came from the same origin, that you would never even notice that they came from the same place, and boom, you have language. The diversity of language. So the perspective of Torah is, God made us speakers. We're talkers. We don't just talk, we're talkers. Just like we don't just walk, we're walkers. We talk. It's part of the basic nature of beings to talk. And the original language was Lashon HaKodesh. The software is the translations. And it came from Lashon HaKodesh. We all spoke one language, and from that one language we had a variety of different languages. In other words, Hebrew God gave us. The diversification away from Hebrew is our contribution. Second column, page 50, inside. So the Rebbe says, second column, page 50 now, HaHefresh bein Lashon HaKodesh and Lashon Targum. The difference between Hebrew and all other languages is bedugmas HaHefresh bein Avrohom Levanim. It's like the difference which is found in Hasidus at great length between stone and bricks. What is the difference between stone and bricks? The answer is Israel or Egypt. Egypt built with bricks, Israel built with stone. Right? At least as you read in the Chumash. Now the pyramids that are there now, that are 3,000 years old, and they claim 4,000 years old, were built with stone, because had they built with bricks, they'd be gone long. But at a certain point there was no more stones. The Jewish people, when they were slaves in Egypt, used what's called today mud bricks. Much of the Middle East was built on mud bricks. Israel built with stone. Why? Simple. Because Israel has mountains. And if you have mountains, you can quarry stones out of the mountain and make them in certain shapes and build. In a place which is very flat, like in Iraq, like where the Tower of Babel was built, where there were no stones, there were no mountains from which to quarry stones, they made artificial stone. So a stone and a brick is the same idea, except that stone is God-made and the brick is man-made. So Hebrew words, letters, are compared to stones. Hebrew letters are compared to stone. Letters in other languages are compared to brick. Same idea. They're building blocks of words and sentences and paragraphs. But the Hebrew stones, God made. They're natural. The foreign languages are like brick, which means that they're man-made. They serve the same function. One is made by God, another one is made by man. Okay? So we go now to this point in the Sicha. And once we understand the difference between the origins of Hebrew letters and Aramaic letters, and this is like God's and this is like man's, says the Rebbe, HaHefresh, we can now explain the difference. Ben Milos Avrohom Avinu koydem Amila. The level of Avrohom Avinu before the Bris, Uli Achre Zen after the Bris, Who bedugmas achila kanal shavin even l'aleveinu. Until the bris of Avraham Avinu was a brick. After the bris of Avraham Avinu became a stone. Now, neither of those allusions sound especially exciting. In other words, until the bris, Avraham was making himself Jewish. Since the bris, he is a Jew. A brick means a man-made, an artificially created identity. He made himself Jewish. After the bris, he was a Jew. And the Rebbe continues. It says in many places in Sfarim and in Chasidus. Avraham Avinu did all the mitzvahs, the whole Torah, even before it was given. Nevertheless, Higia Oz, all of the efforts Avraham Avinu did during his lifetime by himself, he only reached Avedosei b'Mailas HaKedesh, his work in the steps of holiness, Rakachesh and Evrahim. He became as good as a human being could become, no better. Till he did a bris, he was on his own. And he grew spiritually incredibly. But you cannot climb a ladder that doesn't exist. You can only climb so high. You can climb to the top of Everest. You can't climb higher. There's no mountain. There's no steps. Avraham was a person getting closer to the Eibishter through his own efforts. You cannot go higher than what is humanly achievable. It's just impossible. He was on his own. He wasn't commanded. Skip the parenthesis, Mamayla from on high, and as a result, ve'ein ve'koiche shel nivra, a human being is incapable of la'agir l'mayla mishosh, to go higher than his source. Last paragraph, please, page 50. Omnom kol zeh hoya achekiyem mitzvahs mila. But this idea that Avraham was a self-made Jew, and accordingly he could only become what is humanly possible to become and not more, was only true till the bris. Because everything he did till the bris, he did on his own. Now go to the last two words on that page. Top of 51 now. When God gave him the mitzvah of Milah, says that that in this commandment, at that moment he was mandated from on high. God gave him a mitzvah. He was able to ascend and reach a step of bittul and oneness with his Creator. Mitzvah ha-mitzvah, who gave him this mitzvah, not based on his efforts alone, but based on the divine commandment. At a much higher level. Why? Because when God gives you a commandment, He gives you the power to fulfill it. When God gave Abraham the commandment to do the bris, He gave him the power to achieve a connection to Hashem. In other words, he morphed from being a brick into being a stone. Being artificially Jewish to being actually Jewish. Lachein, therefore, it became possible for him then to reach beyond what is humanly possible. I want to tell you a story. My brother is a shliach, and he's also a Hasidic Yid, made a bar mitzvah. And we spent Shabbos together. And it was a wonderful Shabbos, put it that way. Parts of the Shabbos, there were so many people who came to participate in this bar mitzvah. Part of the Shabbos was basically family. And we sat around at the end of Shabbos, and we were discussing farbrengens. And somebody at the table argued that farbrengens are a waste of time. What's the point of sitting around and telling stories and saying l'chaim and singing songs? What is achieved by farbrengen? Like, what's the point? Learn a blat gemara, you know? So my brother gave a wonderful explanation, and I want to share it with you. How do you make pottery, earthenware vessels, which are of course the classic example of a brick? It's a man-made vessel. You take clay and you need special kind of earth, and you mix it with special kind of water, and there's a very specific recipe. I don't understand how these things are done, but it's an art. And you mold it, give it a shape. And after it's molded, you let it sit and dry. After this vessel sits and dries, it's a vessel. But it's very brittle. You give it a snap and it crumbles. It's brittle. It doesn't have any... it's not congealed. It's not glued together into one piece. So there's an oven that's called a kiln, K-I-L-N. It's a very hot oven, 1400 degrees. You put this piece of pottery into the kiln and you bake it. And when you bake it, nothing external happens to the pottery. When you take it out of that oven, it looks exactly the same as when you put it in. Before you put it in, it was hard and had a shape. You take it out, it's hard and has a shape, but it doesn't break. It went from being a bunch of pieces of sand glued together to being a vessel. So my brother said, you can go through all the motions of being a Jew, but you're brittle. You're making yourself Jewish. A fabrengen is like an oven that bakes you. It doesn't change anything. It doesn't add anything. But it metamorphoses you from someone who's acting Jewish to someone who is Jewish. It becomes your identity. And the person who had asked the question got very excited. He said, he got it. That's stuck it difficult. We're not supposed to do Judaism, we're supposed to be Jewish. In this Sicha, it's the difference between a brick and a stone. For 99 years of his life, Avrohom was doing Judaism. Then he had a Bris, and he became a Jew. For 9 years, he was climbing a ladder, he was the best human being, a human being and the servant of God. The Bris made him a godly being, a servant of God, as opposed to a person serving Hashem. And the key difference between pre and post Bris was the Bris God told him. It's the first mitzvah he got from God. And the Rebbe says, I'm on page 51, second paragraph, the underline. Shayadei mitzvah zu, through this mitzvah, nizbatla mitzius legamri, his identity as a separate being was completely bittled. V'nisachet im haboide, he became one with the Creator. His achdos gemur, an absolute oneness. Kizu, in such a way, she'ein kamea v'digmas of mitzvah cheres. No mitzvah is equal to this. No mitzvah makes you as one with Judaism as a Bris does. Why? Because you do it in your actual body. You know, according to Torah, you're not allowed to do body mutilations. According to Torah, you're not allowed to even put on tattoos. But the Bris, yeah, is the only exception. Because when you do the Bris, you become one with the Eibishter. Top of the second column now, please. Nimtza. In other words, Shedargas Avedose Shal Avrohom Kedem Shekiyah Mitzvahs Mila. The level of Avram Avinu until the Bris was Shehigia Barak at Shedesh Anevraim. He reached only the highest potential level that a person could reach. He was like a brick. You know what I mean? He was he was acting Jewish. He was doing Judaism. Notwithstanding that there's no question Avram served Hashem at incredibly great levels. He accomplished great things. And he became higher and higher in his bittul to Hashem. Higher and higher still. He was still making himself Jewish through his own acts. He remained a human being, a physical creation, who was in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. As opposed to when he did the Bris, the circumcision. That moment, he was raised up through that effort. He became a stone. What does that mean, became a stone? He became not someone who's doing Judaism, but someone who is Jewish. Like as if God molded him to be a Jew. By doing this mitzvah, now he stopped being someone who is human, serving God, and he became a godly person. So then, when he then serves Hashem, it's ke'ein mas tishmaim. A yid does a mitzvah, it's like as if Hashem is doing a mitzvah. Because he's representing Hashem in this world. Because we're not bricks, we're stones. We're not acting Jewish, we're Jewish. Says the Rebbe in the next paragraph. Therefore, kaidem shenimel, until Avram has a bris, his relationship to Hashem is Aramaic. It's an artificial language. It's a man-made language. His level is a vision in Aramaic. Why? Until the bris, his whole relationship with the Eibishter was his own language, his own connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The other makanal, which is achievable through people. You know what? I can give you a very good example for this. I've had this experience as a student as well as a teacher. As a student, I used to say this to my teacher, and as a teacher, my students say it to me. In other words, a teacher teaches you, and you say, in other words. Why do you say in other words? You say in other words because you think your teacher didn't say it properly, and you could say it better. When usually the case is you didn't understand the teacher properly, and by in other wordsing it, you're taking away all the little pieces they didn't understand and making it click. And very often you'll tell a teacher in other words and you'll make them nervous. Why? Because the teacher is thinking, if I wanted to say it in other words, I would have said it in other words. I said it the way I said it because that's the way it needs to be said. Your in other wordsing it is accommodating your lack of comprehension. So instead of making what I said less, open your brain up to more. And I've had this experience as a student. I remember being very frustrated by telling my teachers and rabbis in other words and getting these funny looks. And I couldn't understand why they didn't think I was a genius. I thought I was a genius. And as a teacher, I'm very impatient when people tell me in other words. I'll tell them straight. If I wanted to say it, those words, I would have said it. I said it this way because this is the way it needs to be said. So you have in Hasidus a whole discussion about the difference between saying something in the first form and saying something in other words. It's called tselem admus. Tselem would be the first form, and admus would be the in other words. Repeating it in a different language. It distorts, not a little, fundamentally. When you repeat something in other words, there's something lost that can never be retrieved, because it's not little. The way it was said originally, in the language in which it was spoken first, is the way it needs to be said. Everything else is a translation. It's taking away a certain quality which you can't retrieve. And that's the difference between Hebrew and Aramaic. Until Avrohom did a bris, his relationship with Eibishter was in other words. After the bris, the relationship we have with Eibishter was in God's words. Verstehst? Avodah mitzvah smila, through the circumcision, he giel lebechines vayera. God showed himself to him directly. Shu b'loshen hakedesh, which is in Hebrew, b'dugmas ha'even shehi b'dei shamayim, like a stone which is from heaven. In other words, Avrohom began to speak about God in the language of God, which he didn't do until then. Page 52. And the Rebbe goes on to say, we just divided Avraham Avinu's life into two parts, pre-bris and post-bris, and gave a very powerful distinction. Until the bris, he was acting Jewish. After the bris, he was a Jew. Until the bris, his language was like Aramaic. After the bris, his language was like Hebrew. Brick versus stone. He says, now let's talk about prophets. There's two types of prophets. There's all prophets, and then there's Moses. There's also a prophet. What's the difference between Moshe Rabbeinu and all other prophets? All other prophets used to say, Koi Amar Hashem, which means God said approximately this. Moshe Rabbeinu used to say, Zeh Hadavar, God said exactly this, precisely this. All other prophets had a vision, which they processed and internalized and gave it back to you, quote, in other words. Moshe Rabbeinu had a vision, which he processed, and he gave it back to you exactly the way he got it. Avrohom, before the bris, was in the category of koi. God said approximately this. After the bris, he was in a level of zeh. God said this precisely. Therefore, until the bris, he's speaking in Aramaic. After the bris, he's speaking in Hebrew. Top of page 53 now, please. I skipped because of time constraints. Now we get back to the angels. God spoke in Aramaic, says the Zohar, because he spoke in Hebrew, the angels would object. Why? Because the angels claimed he's no better than us. Avram could not see God so directly until the circumcision took place, because of the angels' complaints. And the Rebbe says why? The very fact that the angels would have complained had God spoken to him in Hebrew proves that proves that he's not worthy of prophecy. In other words, read the story backwards. If the Zohar says God was afraid angels would complain, because God knew that the angels would be right to complain. Avram didn't deserve prophecy. No, he didn't. He was a person like they were, creation like they were. It was before the bris. No, notwithstanding how much he had grown in serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he was also bottled Hashem and so forth. He was after all a creature. You know what? So were the angels. Avram was no better or no worse than an angel, and therefore the question becomes, why are you talking to him and not talking to me? Hashem didn't speak to the Avrohom in Aramaic, so the Malachim shouldn't complain. Hashem spoke to Avrohom in Aramaic because the Malachim had a complaint. He had no business talking to Avram Avinu. He made an exception. He spoke to an undeserving person to bring him into a state of deservedness and worthiness. He spoke in Aramaic not because the angels were going to complain, but because the complaint of the angels was a fact. So we see something very interesting here. And that is, acting Jewish has a lot of your own effort. Being a Jew is a gift from God. But still, being a Jew adds a dimension to Jewishness which cannot possibly be replicated, repeated, copied when you're acting like a Jew, when you're doing it in other words. So the Rebbe therefore says, when you tell the story of Avroham's life, you tell his life's story in two stages. You tell the story of his life as he is doing Judaism, and then you tell the story of his life as he's become a Jew. Doing Judaism is Lech Lecha. Being a Jew is Vayera. Page 53, second column, I'm reading inside. Lech Lecha and Yoni. What's the translation of the word Lech Lecha? To grow, to be in motion. Moving from one place to another place. Continues the Rebbe and he argues, however, Kol HaMadreg is cool. If you make 1,000,000 steps, what is a non-disputable fact? Your body has never left the earth. Right? You ever heard of that mashal? When you walk, you always have one foot on the ground. You never leave the earth. When you run or jump, you raise both feet from the ground. Walking means you're always connected to the first step. It's always gradual. There's no quantum changes. It's step, step, step. It's an orderly traverse from place to place. You're always linked to your initial step, which of course represents he couldn't reach higher than the source of humanity. As opposed to Vayera, which indicates seeing the essence of godliness. What does the word Vayera mean? He sees God directly. Why? Because after the Bris he becomes one with the Creator, and he was able to reach this level of oneness with his Creator when he mitzvah mila, only when he did the mitzvah of mila. And the Rebbe finishes the Sicha by teaching us a lesson. And the lesson is we have to constantly grow, like Lech Lecha, and that the Eibishter promises us we'll achieve, like Vayera. Okay, so here's another insight, again on Bris. And what did we learn today? That Avrohom Avinu's life changes in the most basic way before and after the Bris. And in plain words, before the Bris he was doing Judaism, after the Bris he was a Jew.